Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast, your source for Packers news, notes, and analysis. My name is Tommy, and I'm one of your hosts, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, my dad, Matt. Dad, welcome back.
You say almost always.
Yes,
yeah, it's
almost
not quite always, but yeah, I was incommunicado, as it were, in the mountains for music and hiking, and with very spotty internet connection. So I've been in the mountains. I have not actually been to the mountaintop, so I don't have really any grand vision and insight for everybody. But we'll do it. We'll do our best.
So it's like normal then.
Right.
So nothing has changed. We're back to our regularly scheduled program.
Nothing has changed.
Good to know. I'm glad we haven't gotten too big delusions of grandeur. We need to keep you from the mountaintop. Because,
I guess we could still have those.
I mean, they are delusions.
That just means they're just not founded in reality.
Well, hence the delusion. But yes, so we are here today, 2 weeks away from training camp, from Packers training camp. Very close. We're almost there. We're recording to you night of Wednesday, July 12th. And we are going to talk a little bit today.
We're getting closer.
Almost there. We're getting through the doldrums of the offseason. You, our dear listeners, and us together, we are doing it. Today we are going to talk a little bit about some players who are primed for regression. Regression's a bit of a scary word. A lot of people usually think it means coming back down to something, but it could also mean coming back up. It can be...
In this case, we mean regression to the mean rather than just going backwards.
Exactly. And so we're going to talk a little bit about players who had really good seasons last year that might not have been their normal level of performance, and some players who had really poor seasons last year that also might not be their level of performance. Some players we expect to kind of take a step back possibly this season if last year was a bit of an aberration from what they had done previously, and then some players who we think might kind of bounce back this year if they had a poor year last year or poor statistics this year. We're going to be talking a little bit about PFF grade, which obviously not perfect, but is a good all-encompassing type deal. Obviously, it has its flaws, but it's still useful in its own way. Talk a little bit about missed tackle percentage. Talk a little bit about DVOA for certain positions. Talk a little bit about specifically receiving grade and rushing grade for some of the running backs. We're going to talk about all that today. Talk about players essentially, like we said, regression in those areas. But first, let's talk a little bit about Packers news. We don't have a whole lot going on, actually, but first, let me pitch a couple of things. I'm out of practice. So, if you like what you hear today, come give us a follow.
We're not even in training camp ourselves yet, listeners. Things might be a little bit rough.
This is the warm-up. But yes, so if you like what you hear here today, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. We tweet out when we have new episodes, articles we find interesting, pieces of Packers news, etc., etc., etc. So if you want to stay up to date on all things Titletown, come give us a follow there. Once again, it's at FatherSonPacker. You can also find us on all podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. You can find us there. You can find us on YouTube, so come give us a follow on those platforms, or on YouTube. We post all our episodes on YouTube as well. If you want to subscribe to us on YouTube, it would really help us out. It would really help our numbers. But yeah, so those are all of the pitches. But let's also talk a little bit about Packers news, and not a whole lot going on this time of year. I think the two biggest pieces of news, one is not really Packers related, but is pseudo-Packers related, and that is that the Jets are going to be on Hard Knocks, Dad, which means Aaron Rodgers is going to be on Hard Knocks, which,
right,
is going to be
might be entertaining for Packers fans.
I think it's a great choice for the NFL, honestly. I think that's like a no-brainer.
I don't see what other choice they had with this on the table.
Yeah, well, they could have made the wrong choice, I guess, is the other choice on the table, because this is clearly the right choice in my opinion.
Couldn't put that past them.
But here's the thing is, I think it's just going to be entertaining as all hell. I mean, you got the biggest media market. You got Rodgers in a new place. You got Hackett's always entertaining. I love watching Hackett talk. He's funny. I just think it's going to be very interesting. That's just a kind of pseudo-adjacent piece of Packers news. And then the other thing is that The Athletic recently did a 5-part podcast series called The Play Callers on the kind of modern Kyle Shanahan tree. I'm just started it. I'm like 1 part in. And 4 more to go.
Right. And so that tree includes
Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, Matt LaFleur, Mike McDaniel, and I believe those are the 4 main ones that they focus on throughout it. But a couple little nuggets from Matt LaFleur in it. Justice Mosqueda compiled all of these on Acme Packing Company, but they're all also in that podcast series as well. I think the funniest. Do you want the funny piece of news first, Dad, or do you want the real piece of news first?
Let's start with the funny piece, the funny bit.
Well, the funny bit is apparently when all four of these coaches worked together with the Texans during, I forget which year it was. But the funny piece of news is the rest of the Texans coaching staff called them the Piss Boys, which is just one of the best nicknames I've ever heard. They later rebranded to the Fun Bunch when they were with Washington, but a rebrand's just a rebrand. I mean, it's like P. Diddy and Puff Daddy. I mean, everyone still knows you're the Piss Boys.
Yes, which adds maybe new context for your piss running hot.
That's a good point. Have you ever
which LaFleur likes to say?
Have you ever had a nickname of such vulgar sources, or are we not sharing those? But anyway,
I won't share what my nickname was, before first grade.
Okay. Well, that's the silly piece of news. The more interesting piece of news is that it was reported by the essentially the person that was doing this podcast series, last name Rodriguez. I forget the first name right now, of The Athletic. That LaFleur was reportedly working through clips of the Niners, Dolphins, and Chiefs offenses this offseason. He has said in the past that he is 100% about taking ideas from other offenses and trying to incorporate them in. I think he said that every week he has people essentially look at what were like, I think at the time the wording he used was like the coolest plays from that week, and then bringing them to essentially the Packers offensive staff and being like, hey, do we think we can incorporate this stuff? And I think it's always a great thing to be trying to take stuff from the best. Dad, I think that's exciting. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I think that's exciting. That's an exciting group of offenses to borrow from, based on, for the Chiefs multiple years and the Dolphins last year, and then the Niners with the way, especially if the Packers are going to lean on the running game, to look at what the Niners have been doing.
Yeah, and I think, with the way the Packers, I think you could say running game was a bit disappointing last year. It could definitely help them to incorporate some new ideas, and no one runs the ball better than Shanahan. And McDaniel is...
Yeah, it's like it doesn't matter who they plug in there in the backfield.
Nope. Doesn't matter at all. Doesn't matter if their offensive line is kind of mediocre. Doesn't matter if the running backs are mediocre. Doesn't seem to matter at all. They're always just running the ball. And then McDaniel, obviously, got that great vertical passing attack with the Dolphins, but he's a big running game guy, too. He was a run game coordinator with the Niners before he was the head coach of the Dolphins. And then you got Andy Reid, who's just Andy Reid. I mean, he knows more about football than more about offensive football, at least, than maybe anyone. And always seems to be picking up something new. And he's that guy, and there's a reason he's got multiple Super Bowls with the Chiefs now. And obviously, one of those reasons is Patrick Mahomes.
One of those reasons I think is Patrick Mahomes.
Yes, I mean, obviously. But also, I think, Reid sometimes doesn't get quite enough credit, I think, because people give it all to Mahomes, and it's kind of a bit LaFleur-like. People don't give LaFleur as much credit just because he's only worked with Rodgers. But we're going to see this year, and I think it's a great jumping-off point to be trying to take some more stuff from these other offenses in areas where the Packers can improve, because I think the downfield passing game was left something to be desired at times last year besides Christian Watson go balls and performative deep balls. As have you heard this, the performative deep balls thing?
Is that when you just heave it to somebody in double coverage with no hope of being depleted?
It's what the Athletic Football Show, Robert Mays and Nate Tice called Aaron Rodgers, the Aaron Rodgers 4th and 2 or third and 8,
third and 5. It's the 3rd and 2 that's the real irritating.
Yeah,
one.
It was just five, drop, hit the back foot, hit the back foot, and instantly throw it as hard as you can down the sideline. I love those. My favorite thing. But anyway, so improvement, downfield passing, I think taking some of that from the Dolphins and Chiefs. Obviously, it's easier for the Dolphins when you have that level of speed on the field with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. It's not really replicable. Although, Christian
speed
Watson,
the Packers have not had the last couple of years, and now they have a lot more of.
I was going to say, Christian Watson might be as fast as them, at least at a full sprint. Probably doesn't accelerate quite as fast as them. And then, running game stuff from the Niners. But those are the two big pieces of news. Not a whole lot going on this time of year. The only other thing I saw was that Aaron Jones was advancing in a celebrity, goodness, what was it? A celebrity cornhole tournament.
Oh,
was the only other thing that I saw.
Is this back in Texas or where?
It must have been, I would imagine. Although, you know that some places call it bags?
I have not heard that before.
They just call it bags.
Yeah.
Don't call
we
it
actually had a little cornhole set we brought with us camping.
Ah, nice.
We have a little portable mini cornhole set that I had set up at our campsite last week.
But the fact that is third on the list of Packers news items this past week.
We are going deep for news. We're talking about cornhole tournaments.
But pretty much that's all you need to know. So let's move on to the meat and potatoes, as we always like to say, which is talking about these players that we... Good Sherlock Holmes reference. Robert Downey Jr., that is, not BBC. Let's talk a little bit about these players that we think... Well, we have players to talk about. We also have the team as a whole to talk about. And we're going to start on the defensive side. And we're going to talk a little bit about... I would say we have a good amount more defensive players that we expect to regress one way or the other this year. And I think that's kind of indicative of how we feel about the defense as a whole. Is like we're hoping it bounces back, because there was some not so good stuff last year, and
it was,
I think, the biggest
disappointing and to almost everybody.
Yes, and I think the biggest
thing, including Joe Barry. It's like, I don't know how this happened.
I would hope he can.
We have to find the man who's responsible for this. Yes,
the Tim Robinson hot dog meme. I would hope by now he's figured it out, but I think one of the biggest. Okay, I'm going to phrase it like this. I think one of the biggest positives when Joe Barry came in 2 years ago was that they immediately became one of the best tackling teams in the league. And then last year, they really fell off of a cliff. And so this is the first area of regression that we're looking at, hopefully in a positive manner. And that is that last year, so 2 years ago, they had a missed tackle percentage of 9.73%. And then last year, they had a missed tackle percentage of 11.46%. 2% is a good amount in this case. So here's my question, Dad. So they were really good first year with Joe Barry, and then they kind of fell off a cliff this past year with Joe Barry. The 2 years under Pettin before that were not particularly good.
Were even worse. I mean, they fell off a cliff, and it still didn't get to as bad as the tackling percentage was under Pettin.
Well, that's why that's why I have a question here. And it's that you had this as one of your areas of regression, you're hoping to get better at tackling.
Looking for positive regression.
For positive regression, getting better at tackling this year. You could make the argument, and I'll make the argument as devil's advocate, that last
year was the outlier.
Hey, you took the words out of my mouth.
Yes, it could be that last year. It could be that at the beginning of last year. That 2021 was the outlier. That at the beginning of last year, we could have looked at the numbers here and said, oh man, they're going to get worse at tackling again this year, because they just had their best in, I don't know how many. I didn't go back further years, so they only went 4 for the whole team.
I mean, if I remember correctly, they were second in the league, and
they were really good. And this, one reason I wanted to bring this particular point up is I've heard a lot of people talk in the offseason about how bad the Packers were at tackling last year, and how can we see a future of them being better. It's like, well, just the year before, they had been really good. And don't you remember when Barry first came on board, there are all these stories about how he's emphasizing tackling and tackling the donut himself and diving to show people how he wanted it done, and it seemed to work. And so...
And the thing is, it's you look at the year by year, though, and you see 12% missed tackle rate, 12.5% missed tackle rate, 9.7% missed tackle rate, great, 11.5% missed tackle rate, and you're like, one of these things is not like the others. One of these things just doesn't belong. And it is the good one, I'm gonna say. And so to me, it's you could say, hey, they were good first year under Barry, they were bad second year under Barry. Hopefully they kind of even out and hit somewhere in the middle there, and they kind of bounce back a little bit. You could also say, hey, they were bad 2 years, they were good 1 year, and then they were bad again. It's maybe if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. I don't know. It's kind of difficult to tell, because also those 2 years before, different middle linebacker group, much worse middle linebacker group. And so
Right.
Linebackers making the majority of the tackles on the team. But at the same time, hey,
usually like linebackers, and you get a lot of tackles from linebackers, and then sometimes safeties.
And I was going to say safeties is the next position group, but we're losing our best tackler in the safety room. So it's like there's something there. But anyway, that's kind of the first one we wanted to talk about. If you're an optimist, you could say they're going to regress positively there. If you're not an optimist, you could say they regress positively 2 years. they regress negatively last year.
They negatively regress back to the mean, yes.
But the next group to talk about is the safeties. And the first one we want to talk about is Savage. Dad, you want to take this one away?
Yeah, so looking at Savage's numbers over the last 40. So last year, his PFF grade was a putrid 47.5.
I mean,
below average.
You don't need PFF grade to know he played poorly. I mean, he got benched. Like it is what it
right.
is.
So the average for listeners, the average NFL safety is 60. So he was well below average. So not even like below average for like a starter or a first round pick.
Just bad.
But so, and then the year before he was 58.5, which still isn't great, but was a lot better.
I'll take 58.5 when the alternative
it's looking good now. And then before that, he was 75.3 and 67.1. So significantly better, especially. And remember, like at the end of that second year, which was under Pettin in his second year, it's like he's looking like he could be turning into a star.
Well, I mean, the game that I remember is the one against the Eagles. Jalen Hurts' like first like real action, I feel like, if I remember correctly, in the league. And Savage had this awesome diving pick on the right side, kind of like right hash, where Hurts thought he could get it in, and Savage just dove like 2 whole yards. Although now that I'm thinking about it, that would have been his second year. Yeah, that would have been that year, because last year was Hurts' second year as a starter, 2 years was Hurts' first year as a starter. The math is mathing, I think, for me.
The math is adding up.
That would have been that's the game that stands out to me as like that's like the best I've seen Savage play is that Eagles game.
Yeah. But even if those 2 previous years, 2020 and 2019, were because it was under Pettin in a different system and he was so much better, I still think there's room for positive regression to him just to get back to 2021.
Yeah. And the thing is, it would be a big boon for them if he could just get back to average, because he's their most experienced safety now, and they need him to at least be passable, because they can't afford for their best safety to be that bad. And I don't think he would be their best safety. I would hope
if he was that bad.
But I think most talented safety, I guess, is what I mean to say. And for him, it's like, it's kind of make or break time for him too, because he's going into that fifth year.
He's playing for money now. This is his 5th year.
Exactly.
His contract runs out after this year, so he's going to be playing on a new contract somewhere next year. And how much that contract is going to depend on what he shows this year.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like
wherever that is.
They have talked a bit about trying to get him back into that role that had him have so much success in his first and second years. I mean, you remember first year they were raving about him. They were saying no one had picked up the playbook as fast as he did under Pettin.
And he started from week 1. He's like one of the rare rookies. They've had star players as rookies. They didn't start at week 1, like Jair or Elton didn't start week 1, the first week of the rookie year.
Yep, not TJ Lang. What is his name? The guard that started for the Packers that year.
Lane Taylor?
Yes. I wanted to say TJ Lang, and I knew it wasn't right, and it was kind of close.
Let's just mash them together into TJ Lang Taylor.
It's kind of close. You can see how that could get stuck in my brain. It's one of those things where it's just like, don't think about zebras.
Right. Once it's in your brain, it blocks the real word.
Yes, but we are getting a little off topic here, as we are wont to do. Let's talk a little, because I think what we essentially come down to is that they were really high on Savage. We have seen Savage play well in the NFL. We know he can do it. It's just about doing it in this role or changing the role so that he plays better. Or that it's a role that he's more comfortable in, I guess. And obviously he can do a lot to help that too, by not gambling as much, by actually tackling people, because I think that's like the biggest thing for me for him, is that he just throw his shoulder at guys and just doesn't wrap up sometimes. Or he takes bad angles, which he's done since he was a rookie, and no perfect play.
Yes, there's. I remember some plays where he took a bad. The Dalvin Cook, he comes flying in and not in balance to. But we even if they don't put him back in his optimal role, I think we can still
get back to average.
A reasonable amount of hope that he'll be better than last year.
Yes, but let's move along here. The next player we wanted to talk a little bit about, which is unfortunately going in the other direction, someone we think maybe won't be as good this year, is Rudy Ford. So Rudy Ford is currently taking starting snaps next to Darnell Savage in all mini camps and training. Like every single time the Packers have put their starting defense on the field, Rudy Ford has been next to Darnell Savage. Ford last year had a PFF grade of 74.6, but before that he had PFF grades of 57.7, 51.8, which was in small sample size, blank, and then 42.1. And so last year was by far the best season of his career, but it was kind of bolstered by having 3 really good games against the Cowboys, Eagles, and Vikings. And it's not that those games shouldn't count. I mean, he played well in them. He had 2 picks against the Cowboys. But it's kind of one of those things where if you're really, your grade's getting pulled up by having just 3 outstanding performances, is that something that's sustainable to the next year? I'm not sure. We do expect him to be better at tackling next year. He went from having a 5.9% missed tackle rate to a 13.3% missed tackle rate, so something was in the water in Green Bay last year.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, that there's so many players who had one of their worst tackling percentages of their careers last year, which is actually this is in the reverse. So he had a much better overall defensive grade with a much worse missed tackle percentage.
Yeah, and
So I was, and I went back, so I dug out these numbers, and so I wanted to look a little more context at his career. So the last 2 years are the only ones where he has a lot of snaps, over 400, and then the other ones are 60, 80, 50, or even less. I think in 2019, so that we didn't wasn't even enough to count. But one thing I did want to check is okay, is there hope? So if you look at the numbers overall, it looks like he could be a candidate to negative regress next year compared to how well he played. But, and this is something I didn't look at when I first got the numbers, his alignment is different last year compared to before.
That's true.
So it may be that they were not comparing apples to apples here, because he was used differently, as Savage has been used differently under Barry, and maybe that explains why he's not as good and won't be able to get up to that excellent level, but still could get up to a decent level. Ford, I need to get this back up again.
Well, while you pull it up,
last year he was.
Say...
Go
ahead.
So last year, 3/4 of his snaps were as free safety. The previous year with Jacksonville, it was more like 3/4 of his snaps were in the slot. So playing a very different role when he got that worst grade.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And the thing that was interesting to me is how poor his missed tackle rate was. When last year I felt like he was one of the only people on the team who could actually tackle. Because honestly,
looked good in comparison.
Well, the thing is, it's they put him in for Savage when they benched Savage, and I was like, finally, 2 safeties who can tackle.
Okay, well, you might notice that Savage, I looked at his missed tackle. So his missed tackle rate last year was 18.8.
Ah, okay, so
it was much worse.
It was much worse.
But
18.8?
Yeah, but if you look at his...
But 1 in 5 tackles, he missed the tackle?
Yeah. But the thing is, if you compare that to his other years, I didn't put him in as a positive regression candidate because his other years are 15.7, 15.4, and 20.6.
I mean,
so it's kind of right on track with his career.
Yeah, well, but we're back to talking about Savage. But so Ford is someone that we think, I think that's very interesting about the alignment, though, because I would actually argue then that I would not necessarily label him as a candidate for. So
I may have been remiss in including him here without looking at a little bit more of the context, which I minute have just looked up right now while we're in the middle of the recording.
The jury will strike that. Ignore that last comment from the defense. But anyway, I've been watching a lot of The Lincoln Lawyer on Netflix, so I've been using a lot of lawyer lingo in my day-to-day life.
I object.
The next player to talk about is, we have more Tarvarius Moore on here. I don't know if I necessarily want to talk about him because last year was such a small sample size for him. Do you want to just move on to Nixon?
Sure. Why don't you move on to Nixon?
Okay, so moving on to Nixon, Keyshawn Nixon, projected to be the Packers' starting slot corner to go into the year. He is someone that we are actually projecting to get better next year, and this is not taking into account his kick returning because I don't know if that's getting any better because that's about as good as it can get. But 2 years ago, while playing far fewer snaps, admittedly, he had a grade of 77.4, but then last year it fell all the way down to 61.2 when he did play a lot more snaps. So you can say that, hey, just like the efficiency kind of dropped when the load came up. But, I would say that you wouldn't expect it to drop quite that much, all the way from well above average, all the way down to average. Like 77.4 is actually far above average, and then all the way down to around average. I think he'd be a slightly above average slot corner, would be what I would project him to be based on how we saw him with the Raiders before he was with the Packers, although albeit in limited sample size. And so he's someone that we think should be able to kind of get, I wouldn't call it a bounce back because I don't think anyone would say Nixon played necessarily bad last year, but to be better this year than he was last year. What do you think, Dad?
Yeah, I think there's a reasonable hope that he can be better this year. And in part, I think he can expect a little bit more consistent usage and so preparation for playing the position. That I think also is a reason to hope for him to be better this year than last.
Yeah, and they're going to need him to be because, the slot position is really important. And I think it was Andy Herman who was expressing his excitement about seeing Nixon in more of a full-time role with the Packers defense. Because, the slot position in this scheme can be one that's used in a variety of different ways, whether it's blitzing. More and more teams are putting their star receivers in the slot and moving them around. I know, for example, we remember when Devontae Adams was with the Packers, they had him in the slot a ton. CeeDee Lamb plays a ton in the slot. Justin Jefferson plays in the slot a good amount. And so Nixon's going to be charged with covering these players because he does not really hold up outside very well. He's more of a pure slot guy. And so they're going to need him to bounce back because, the slot is not, it's not a part-time role in the NFL. The slot corner is not a part-time role in the NFL anymore. It's a full-time job, and they're going to need him to play well.
Yeah, slot corner is a starter, basically.
Yeah, 100%. Every team
probably plays more than your whatever third D tackle.
Yeah, nowadays, yes. The next player is Devondre Campbell, specifically with his missed tackle percentage. And we already kind of saw this last year, Dad. Do you want to kind of talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, so if we look at his last year's missed tackle percentage was 10.1%. So the previous year, when his first team All-Pro was 2.9. And then all the other years, he did have a blip of 8.1, but 5.9, 3.4, 5.5. So just looking at the yearly number, it looks like he should be better. But then if you look at last year on its own, over the last 7 weeks of the season, so he got the bad start. For the last 7 weeks of the season, he only had 2 missed tackles out of 51 attempts, so 3.9%. So for half the season, he was already much better than he was in the first half of the season. So I think that's another bit of data supporting the fact that we expect positive regression from Devondre Campbell in his tackle success rate.
Yeah, and I think when your when your player who is making the most tackles is missing that many tackles, your team is not going to be a good tackling team. It just kind of, and looking at him, you're like, his arms are 1,000,000 miles long. How is he not making every tackle? I mean, and the thing is, that's part of what you could really hang his hat on. Why he got that first team All-Pro nod is it felt like he never let a guy get past him.
There's only 2.9% missed tackle rate previous years. Just a few missed tackles for the whole season.
Crazy. And I mean, that's what earned him that first team All-Pro nod, is just how sure a tackler he was. And we already saw him kind of bouncing back midway through last year. We hope he doesn't start kind of slow like he did last year. We hope the whole defense doesn't start slow. And Joe Barry said himself, we don't have 10 weeks to figure this thing out. We got to hit the ground running. And I think
the other thing I would like to say is the more that he tackles instead of missing, the fewer go back to the safeties.
Who will also? You're saying there's a compounding factor. If Campbell misses a tackle, the safeties are missing a tackle, and we're just adding missed tackles to this.
We get multiple missed tackles on the same play.
Oh yeah, I'm sure we had several of those. I mean,
Alvin Kamara, anybody?
Why did I? That wasn't with Barry though, so I wasn't going to say it. But
that
was literally
true. It wasn't with Barry.
It was the first thing that came to mind was the Alvin Kamara play, and I'm pretty sure. Didn't Tyler Lancaster get him down in the end zone 80 yards downfield?
Lancaster chased him down the entire way down the field and is right there, the closest defender as he goes into the end zone.
Yeah, shout out Tyler Lancaster.
Shout out Tyler Lancaster.
Going down the list though, the next player that and this one kind of surprised me that his grade was so low was Hollins. PFF grade of just 54 last year after having kind of mid to high 60s the 2 years prior. And it's interesting because I actually thought Hollins played quite well last year. And it seems like the Packers are quite fond of him as well because oftentimes with Gary sidelined with rehabbing from that ACL tear, they've been having Hollins kind of start right next to him a little bit.
Yeah, and Hollins was a little better for the Packers than he was for the Rams. So the Rams stint pulled his overall yearly grade down, though it wasn't incredibly different. Though the individual breakdowns, like his run defense was slightly better, his pass rush was a little better, his tackling was significantly better for the Packers. Basically, in every aspect of the game, he was better for the Packers than he was for the Rams. So I think what we saw watching play the Packers was better than his overall yearly grade.
And that makes sense because I think, when you're playing with better players next to you, and obviously Hollins had Aaron Donald, but besides that,
I was going to say, besides the defensive player of the year,
besides one of the greatest defensive players of all time, but
other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like to play?
How was the play? Yeah. But the thing is, the rest of that Rams roster was, I think, not as good as the rest of the Packers roster. I think this next one though is one that I want to highlight because I think it is paramount that this player returns to form in this next year, and that is Kenny Clark. Because for years now, he has been the anchor of the defense, and last year was his worst year of his career by PFF grade. Worse than his rookie year, even. And you could feel it. You could feel it as the Packers defense that it was the rest of the team. I mean, you could feel the defense playing poorly. You could look at Kenny playing poorly. You could say, chicken or the egg. But I think he was noticeably less impactful last year than he had been pretty much any other year of his career. And I feel like it's fair to say that. And given the fact that they lost the two guys starting next to him, maybe that's a good thing, on the defensive line from last year, I think he's going to have even more weight on his shoulders this coming year, given the inexperience next to him, and they need him to bounce back. I mean, he had a PFF grade of 66.4 last year after being around 75, 74, 80, 90, 87 the 5 years running up to that year. And they need him. They need him badly, Dad. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you could tell is that the year that I think it was 2020, he had the groin pull for the first half of the year, and he wasn't playing quite as well. The whole defense around him didn't play as well. Z wasn't as good. Preston wasn't as good. The other players next to him depended on what he was doing on the field to play optimally, I think. So one thing, you look at this where that was the worst grade of his career and far worse than anything besides his rookie year. Now, maybe you want to make the argument that those high 80s and 90s are less likely to be attainable this many years past. But I think it's very reasonable to expect him to be back in the mid 70s, like he had been mid to upper 70s for the previous 3 years. And that I think there's a decent chance that he gets back to that again.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's just I really can't remember a Kenny play from last year. One does not particularly come to
like
mind
a real splash play
when I think, and I can think of them in years prior. I mean,
like feasting on
on Garrett Bradbury, just
Bradbury,
destroying Garrett Bradbury anytime we played the Vikings, and it's just like I just can't think of like a standout performance from last year when I kind of like off the top of my head. Usually I can think of a play or two. I can think of a whole game. I mean, I off the top of my head, it's like the and I'm trying to remember if it was, I think it was even 2 years ago that he had that those 2 sacks against Justin Fields on a sunny, like a 10 a.m. noon game. It's 10 a.m. for us on the West Coast, noon in the Midwest, and I can even remember that game. I'm pretty sure it was not this past year; it was 2 years ago. Because for a second I thought it was last year. But yeah, it's just they need him because he's one of the stars of the defense, and they rely on him for run defense, and they rely on him for pass rush, and they're gonna really rely on him for run defense this year because they are small along the defensive line. I mean, you got Slayton, yes, Wyatt. I know a lot of people are really high on Wyatt. I got to see it first because he was okay in limited snap counts, but there's a reason he couldn't get on the field last year. And maybe that reason isn't his fault necessarily. But it's been reported that the reason is they didn't like the way he defended the run, and that just adds on to the fact that Kenny's going to have to put more of that burden on his shoulders. And the backups behind Slayton and Wyatt are Wooden, who's like 290 pounds, and Carl Brooks, who's hasn't really played D tackle before. He was an edge rusher at Bowling Green, and then
Jonathan Ford,
who wasn't really active at all.
Is built like a big run stuffer.
Yeah, and that's about all.
But one thing wanted to say about like Kenny, we're talking about like the run defense is like the last 2 years under Barry are by far the 2 worst run defense grades of his entire career by a wide margin.
Do you have anything to say with regards to all these players who have had substantially worse grades under Barry than they did before? I'm just curious. It seems like a pattern that we're running into.
Man.
You know that they interviewed Ejiro Evero for this job. And last year, the Broncos' defense was one of the best in the league.
And I feel a migraine coming on.
I know. Who knows? Who knows what happened there? But anyway.
But yeah. So the other thing. I wanted to say a little bit. I was looking at. So Kenny says his 2 best games last year were against Tampa and the second Minnesota game. He had 2 sacks against Tampa and 1 against Minnesota. So both had like excellent grades. And then he had a really rough stretch in the middle of the year. That's really where his bad games are clustered, from like week 7 through 12. That really, I think, dragged down his overall years. Maybe something was bothering him there that we never heard about.
Yeah, but he was never, because we talked about it at the time, and he was never on the injury report, which he was with the groin. Yeah,
but you know.
Year. Yeah, I know. But the Packers are not.
Sometimes we don't know.
The Packers will always be putting people on the injury report, like even if they were full participants.
They do throw people on all the time, but they also never tell you what's actually wrong with somebody.
Leg, arm,
lower extremity,
lower extremity. But that's our last player on defense that we had in terms of regression. So more opportunities for positive regression than negative regression, which kind of is believable when you think about how kind of underwhelming the defense was last year, given the talent on it. Let's talk a little bit about offense, though. We have just a couple players to talk about here. And the first is Aaron Jones, who we kind of have going in both directions, Dad.
Yeah, though I will say a little bit, it's some of it. So we looked at both PFF and DVOA from Football Outsiders, since you could get this for some of the offensive players. And then, quarterback, there's nothing to compare to. And wide receivers, there's nothing to compare to. Everybody that has 1 year or none, so there's no comparison to be made. So and the tight ends, there's not really much to compare to either. There's DeGuara, but he was kind of the same in like all measurements. But looking at Aaron Jones, if we look at his rushing by PFF, he had amazing year last year, with an over 90 point grade. And his other grades are good. They're not quite as high. It's like 83, 79, 81, 85, 85.
And to be
so
clear,
lots of good grades.
Those are better than good. Those are very good grades.
So
like
yes, I should lots of great. And like but the 90 is a little bit of an outlier. It's like 5 or 6 points more than his second best. So he might have a slight negative regression for his pass rate. However, if you look at DVOA, this is one where you got a different story. His DVOA grade was very similar last year to it was for 4 of his previous 5 years. So if you look using the DVOA numbers, you would not expect a negative regression from Aaron Jones.
You know what? You know what I think might be happening there?
What?
You know, my thought process is, and this is purely speculation, DVOA is a lot more based on like production and numbers. And
but also controlled for opponent.
Controlled for opponent, yes. And then PFF grade is kind of more subjective in some ways, but looking at each play to play. I think you could argue, based on some of our other analyses that have looked at the fact that the Packers' run blocking was really bad, is that the poor run blocking of the Packers kind of opened the door for Aaron Jones to kind of catapult his rushing grade by overcoming poor surrounding circumstances, and that was what let him have that 90 grade. And the fact that his DVOA, his production, kind of relative to what the opponent allows, kind of stayed the same, mostly just kind of makes me think like, hey, he was doing the same thing, but all of the surrounding blocking was worse, and that's why his PFF grade was so much higher last year.
Perhaps.
But
his DVOA, he was fourth best in the league.
Yeah, I mean, I would
for rushing DVOA.
I would not be surprised if that 90.7 PFF grade was easily top 5. I mean,
yeah,
that's
but then other years he's been 5th, 7th, and 7th by DVOA. So he's only had one, which was actually 2 years ago in 2021, where he was not in the top 7.
Yeah, but by overall PFF grade, we do expect him to kind of come down a little bit. But for receiving grade, we actually expect him to kind of kick back up because he was down at 64.6 last year, which was his lowest since his second year in the league. And then the previous years, he was up at 72.5, 76.5, and 82.8. And so we kind of expect him to bounce back there as well.
Yeah, so that's something. So you might expect a slight negative regression in his running grade, but a slightly positive regression in his receiving grade.
Yeah, and I mean,
and I did look to see what's driving that. Is it yards per route run? Did he have more drops? I'm not exactly sure what is driving the difference last year.
While we're talking a little bit about running back receiving grade, another player that we kind of expect to have a positive regression up is A.J. Dillon in that same receiving grade, because he was down at a 51 or 50.6 PFF grade for his receiving last year and was at 65.5 the year before. And so when I'm looking at this and I'm seeing that, hey, both running backs were kind of below their usual standard in catching the ball, in some ways, I'm like, okay, the offense was worse, so that makes sense. You're scoring fewer receiving touchdowns because the offense is worse. Your grade's not going to be as high. But also, I wonder about coaching, because I think you can always just bring this back to the fact that they couldn't make pony personnel work. And I don't know what you think about that, but those are kind of the three things that I look at there. And the fact that both the Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, we think could have bounce-back years catching the football, is kind of just more of a thought of like, hey, we think the offense as a whole could have a bounce-back year a bit as well.
Yeah, and it could be that some other things like Rodgers' thumb, the offensive line being, in flux, and some might say disarray at the beginning of the year. I think it's fair to call week 1 disarray with Newman and Hansen both starting.
What a ridiculous decision.
Yep. But so I would say for the Dillon, the receiving, that the PFF and the DVOA agree very strongly here, where last year Dillon's DVOA receiving rank among running backs was 45th. Yeah. And 2 years ago he was 6th.
Yeah. And it's like, is it scheme? And we were talking about this before we started recording. It's like, I think Dillon, like, as a receiving back to me, or like as a receiver, as a pass catcher, Goodness, 3 different ways to say the same thing. I'm really using my seconds here preciously. Dylan as like a pass catcher, I think he has really good hands. I have questions sometimes about like how much he's giving you with the ball in his hands without much of a running start. Because I feel like when you're catching the ball, you're not getting as much forward momentum as you are like when you're getting the ball like handed off to you downhill. And it's kind of a similar question I have as to why he was getting so many runs out of the shotgun last year, because he's not getting as much like momentum going downhill. Got to like move to the side and then move forward. And same with pass catching. It's like, hey, you got to kind of like catch and then set your feet, and you already got people coming down on you. I don't know. I don't know how much truth there is in that. It's just kind of, it's just my thought that like, hey, he doesn't always, in my opinion, it's not always super inspiring. Like in terms of making people miss. I feel like if he can catch it and there's room for him, he does a good job. Like there's that, was the play against the Rams, I think last year, where they had to, no, it wouldn't have been last year because Devontae Adams was blocking for him 2 years ago, where he took it like halfway down the field, like he was bodying people up and down the field, and then Bengals 2 years ago. Goodness, I'm trying to think last year. There's not one that necessarily pops to mind, and I'm rambling a little bit now. But
I mean, individual play or
yeah, individual play. And then, yeah. But my point is more just that I think for him, I think it matters a little more how he's touching the ball when he's catching the ball schematically. Like he needs a little more space to catch the ball. He needs to be moving. And as opposed to Jones, who I think can make people miss from a standstill a little more easily.
Yeah, a lot of times you might say one thing is like Dylan is kind of going to get you what's there as a receiver rather than make something. Though, if you compare the 2 years, his like catch percentage was way down last year compared to 2021, but also his yards after catch per reception were also down. They're both down significantly from the year before.
Yeah. Moving along, though, and wrapping up here, let's talk a little bit about Elgton Jenkins since we're getting a little tight on time. We both think that his pass blocking can take a big jump this next year. And similarly to Devondre Campbell, it took a big jump halfway through last year, too. Over his first 6 weeks of 2022, kind of when he was coming back from that ACL, and also a lot of those games at right tackle, so kind of two confounding factors there. He had a pass blocking grade of 56.25, but over the last 9 weeks of 2022, that skyrocketed all the way back up to 73.4. Overall, for the whole year, he was at 67.8, and was at 81.2 the year prior. And so there is really a lot of room for Jenkins to kind of bounce back in his pass blocking. And we already kind of did see him bounce back in his pass blocking with the move back to left guard, with more time off the ACL. I maintain that I think if they had just let him play out at right tackle and kind of let that just situation, let him like heal and let him get used to it, I think he would have been fine. But they chose to move him back to left guard, and he's great there. And we think he's going to go back to being great on a full-time basis there next year.
Yeah. So one thing I would just add to that, it's like in support of your notion that he probably would have been fine if they left him at right tackle long enough to fully recover. His worst graded game of the year was actually week 7 when he had been moved already to left guard.
Okay.
And it was only after that, and then I think it seemed like he didn't play in week 8. And then week 9 and on is when he started playing better.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, I think it was just like they were a little hasty with that decision to move him back to left guard, in my opinion. Because it's like, what did you expect? He came back early from a torn ACL. Like, he's a big man. Yeah. Like, he's a large human being.
I think he just wasn't really physically ready. And it may be that moving, pushing with that leg was harder to do on the right side before the leg was ready.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a very difficult situation for Elgton, and I think a lot of people were far too harsh on him last year.
Yeah.
And
the other thing, I guess the main thing I would say to that is like I think some people have sort of written off the notion that he could play right tackle in the future because of that, and I think that's way too premature.
Way too premature, especially when we've seen him play right tackle at a high level before. Last but not least, so to say,
Really?
is Royce Newman, who we expect to kind of bounce back in a pass blocking sense this year. Because as a rookie, he was up around average, 60.2, but then this past year, he kind of fell down a little bit to around a 55 below average. I think Royce Newman does get a little too much hate. I think he is good at certain things. He's bad at other things. He can't pick up a stunt, which is perhaps...
Yeah. Even like the good parts of his rookie year, he still was like misdiagnosing stunts left and right. He got beat like almost every time that there was a stunt.
Yeah. And like he has really good get off. He's not the strongest, but I don't think his functional play strength, like, it's not great, but he's not the worst I've seen. He's pretty nimble, he's pretty agile, he can play guard and tackle okay. Not great, but having that flexibility is nice. The question is whether or not being able to pick up a stunt is a fatal flaw, and if he's good enough at the rest of the stuff for him to have that flaw. But we do expect him to kind of be better in a pass blocking role. I don't have a whole lot more to say on Newman. We are getting a little long on time. Is there anything you want to add there, or should we wrap up?
Yeah, and we don't know how much Newman is even going to play this year if the line stays healthy, because he's
hopefully
no
not
higher than 7th on the depth chart. He's
hopefully not much.
He's not even the next man up behind the starting 5. It's going to be, he's maybe 7th.
You could argue he'd be next up at right guard.
Nah.
Who do you think would be next up at right guard?
Tom and Nyman at tackle.
Yeah, fair enough. They just shifted around. Okay, I see what you said. Yeah, but so hopefully we won't see too much of him, but offensive line, it's better to have depth than to not have it. And I think, as a 7th man, it's a fine 7th man to have. He's played NFL snaps, which is more than a lot of 7th players can say. But anyway, that's all we have for you today. If you like what you heard, like we said earlier, come follow us on Twitter while it still exists as a platform, @FatherSonPacker. Come subscribe to us wherever you can find podcast platforms, or on YouTube. It would really help our numbers. We'll be doing an episode a week until the start of the season, when we'll go back to doing 2 episodes a week. We're going to be kind of just previewing the season, and then once training camp starts in 2 weeks, almost there, we're going to be talking a lot about the position battles going on there and predicting our 53s, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you so much for listening, though, dear listeners. We look forward to talking to you next week. And until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.